starting next week. Next week is the midterm. Your study guide, I believe, is up. I think I created a new folder for that. So the study guide is up, and we'll talk about that. We'll set aside some time for that on Monday. Just to make people aware, there is no lecture next Wednesday, right? So don't come to class, as it were. The midterm is on D2L, since this is an online course. It'll open probably 8 a.m. or something. And then on Wednesday, and then it'll close that Sunday, just kind of like everything else we've been doing. So, I mean, obviously you have 5 days to do it, and you can treat it like a quiz, save your work, come back to it, do other classwork, etc. But there's no Zoom lecture next Wednesday. So, and I'll make that clear, obviously, in next week's checklist as well. All right. Any other questions or any comments, bureaucratic things, schedule, due dates, whatever?
That also applies to the recitations, if I remember correctly.
I think so. Yeah. All right. So today we're talking about, or we're reading the Sherry Turkle article for the most part. That's the main article, and a couple of passages from Plato. Those passages are going to be with us for a little bit as we kind of work through issues about, the self, human nature, and of course, how it's sort of related to internet technology. So just a few leading questions here. First, we have what we might call a metaphysical question. This is coming basically directly out of Plato, right? What is the difference between what appears to us and what is real? You might even challenge that and say, well, you can't really make that distinction. Or at least you could ask the next question, which we might call an epistemological question. Epistemology has to do with what we can know. How can we know the differences between what appears to us and what is real, if there is such a difference? Now, if you read the Myth of the Cave section from Plato, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about there is a difference and there's a way to know that difference. Technology question, does technology, especially, our focus, smartphone, social media, that sort of stuff, does this or has this been sort of blurring the line between appearance and reality, right? So here we have this cute little picture of a cat, or two cats, I guess, but is it really one cat, right? Is this an accurate portrayal, for some at least, of how they use social media, right? That's one of the things that we're going to kind of dig into a little bit today. The cat looking in the mirror is ostensibly the real cat, and then how this cat appears to itself through the medium of social media and the technology is this, ferocious lion or something like that. All right. So let's look at just some kind of more specifically Platonic kind of questions. Some questions that come directly from the Myth of the Cave section. We'll get into the Ring of Gaiji stuff a little bit later. So the question here is, and this is one that Plato preoccupies himself with a lot, not just in this dialogue, which is the Republic, but in a lot of his dialogues. It's one of his main concerns. Is there any knowledge in the world that we can be certain of? Can we have certainty in some sense? Well, one question would be, what would count as certain knowledge? The kind of knowledge that, to use Plato's sort of terms, would enlighten you and you couldn't be wrong about in some sense. Secondly, how would we know if or when we found this certain knowledge? Would that knowledge also be certain? So you're kind of getting on different layers or different levels of knowledge. So what Plato's doing in the cave story, it's kind of giving us an analogy or an allegory or a myth, basically, of this kind of idea that we can have certainty, But we don't start there, right? We're actually all kind of in a prison in some sense, and that it takes a lot of hard work to have actual knowledge, right? And he has a pretty high standard for what counts as knowledge, namely certain knowledge, which is kind of redundant, I suppose, for Plato, just because he has such a high standard for knowledge anyway. Certain knowledge for Plato is going to be of what is real, not what appears to be real, but isn't, right? So he's making these distinctions. There is reality, there's appearance of reality, there is knowledge, and likewise, contrasting to knowledge would be something like opinion or belief, which are the same thing for Plato. So the myth of the cave basically gives us an image of how to make this distinction between what is apparently real, namely just the stuff you believe about the world, your everyday beliefs. Obviously, most people, I think, would agree that the things that they believe, just even the mundane things that they believe to be true, right? If you have a belief, typically that means you believe it to be true. Well, what Plato's going to do is show that, for the most part, that's misleading in a sense, right? So he's making this distinction between what is apparently real, and in the story, it's these shadows on this cave wall, and what is really real, right? For that, we need, as the story goes, we need some philosopher or I guess other person. Basically, it's Socrates in Plato's story. We need somebody like a Socrates to sort of pull us out of this cave and allow us to see what is really real. So in the story, right, the apparently real that people actually care about is just these shadows on the wall. And once you start doing philosophy, according to this story, and you sort of make that difficult journey outside of the cave, you become enlightened and you know now what is really real. It's certainly not going to be those shadows. What's more real than the shadows is the things that make the shadows, right? The objects of which they are shadows. And then you just progress up, the sun, right? And then in a different passage in the Republic, he takes this kind of image and talks about it in a much more abstract way. But the idea here is the cave is a sort of education from darkness into light, to use other metaphors that Plato likes to talk about, or metaphors that he prefers. The darkness of the cave, the darkness of having unreflected opinions, that kind of thing, to outside of the cave where you have knowledge, actual knowledge of the real. So it's a little bit, I'll put that video up, by the way. It's like 8 minutes long. It does a nice job of kind of showing what's going on here. But for Plato, basically, the idea is that reality has a kind of structure to it, and we can come to know this structure. So when Plato's talking about what's real, that's going to be pretty much counterintuitive to what we in our everyday lives take to be real. All right. So for Plato, reality is stable, it's eternal, it's unchanging, it's timeless. And the weird part is it's non-physical. You don't really get this from the cave metaphor, but in other parts of the Republic, he makes this quite clear. So we can think of this as the world of being, right? Being or beings that don't change, they're eternal. And that's what, when we have knowledge, that's what our knowledge sort of fixes to, right? Appearance, on the other hand, again, he's making this distinction, is going to be for Plato just an image of reality, kind of like the shadows on the wall are just images of the objects of which they are shadows. So appearances for Plato is going to be unstable, changing, fleeting, fickle, and physical, right? The physical world, if you look out your window, is always changing, right? Trees are growing, rivers are flowing, people are moving, people are growing old, people are being born, they're dying. Things are dying and being born all over the place, even planets and stars. So for Plato, this is the world of becoming, right? So the world of becoming or change is in contrast to the world of stability or being. And this is what, when you become educated by having knowledge of being, and you try to get as far away from becoming as possible. It's a pretty interesting, weird thing, right? So what Plato's essentially doing is taking what we think we know about the world, taking what we think is real, and essentially flipping it, right? Turning it on its head, right? So we tend to think that these sorts of things are real. A nice, beautiful sunset, right? Why do we think this is real? Well, because we much prefer going out to the lake and seeing the sunset than just, say, watching a DVD of it or something. Typically speaking, I would imagine that people would rather sit in front of the fire at Christmas than watch the Yule log on their TV, even though that might be a sort of ironic tradition. Trees, those are real. Your cat, that's real. Even, human artifacts like buildings or anything that we make, those are real. Typically, it's because we can see, touch, taste, smell, hear, whatever. Plato, of course, does not think that he thinks that that's all an image of what's, quote unquote, really real. For example, this. For Plato, something like this is more real or more fundamental than any of this physical stuff, because the physical stuff is just sort of an image of mathematics, really complex mathematics, but mathematics nonetheless. That's not even what's really at even higher reality for Plato. Things like the form of justice or justice itself, the form of the good or goodness itself, beauty itself. These are more real because they're more fundamental for Plato than any beautiful painting or person, right? So it's a weird way of thinking about reality here. For Plato, the most beautiful thing is contemplation of the form of beauty itself, not some physical thing, right? That's an interesting way to think about reality. Counterintuitive, and of course, a lot of people think it's nuts. That's perfectly fine. So this is basically, here I have a couple of pictures of this cave. You can kind of think of it like this, right? So in the story Plato is telling us, there are prisoners represented by the person sitting in this cave. They've been there their entire lives, and what they see are these shadows on this cave wall. Unbeknownst to them, there are other people with these objects, right? So the prisoner sees this bird on a stick shadow, thinks that that's real, takes that to be real, even has stories about it, invents games having to do with, the shadows on the wall, et cetera, et cetera. Unbeknownst to them, there's an actual object making this shadow. And of course, Plato says, look, these people, they're like us, right? And in fact, that's what he wants to say. We are like these prisoners, taking the physical world and the world of our unreflected opinions to be what exhausts not only reality, but what we can know, right? And he thinks that that's complete nonsense. But it's only, again, when you escape from this cave that you can actually understand what's really real. Perhaps you're familiar with the movie The Matrix. Well, where do you think they get this idea? It's this. There's another version that Descartes has, pretend that there's an evil genius that's manipulating your brain and giving you all of your experiences, right? Well, what would happen if you escaped from that and came to understand what's really real? That's what the cave is all about, right? What is it? In the movie, you take a pill Here, you take a philosopher and follow them out of the cave, apparently. Now, we can kind of think about this story in 2021 terms, or even 2011 terms, I guess, right? Is technology, the social media technology, smartphone technology, kind of like the images on the wall of the cave, right? Again, they're like us. Can we make this same kind of comment, as it were, with Plato, that these sort of social media technologies, these things through which we think and conduct major parts of our lives, are these sort of impediments, as it were, to reality? It's an interesting way, or it's an interesting, I guess, heuristic to sort of think about some of these technological issues, the most important being this distinction between appearance and reality. If we can make it, it might be the case that we can't actually sort of legitimately make that distinction. In fact, you can challenge Plato on that very point in his own cave myth. So, for example, say the philosopher does in fact, or say the prisoner does in fact, they're dragged up the rough, steep cliff or whatever out of the cave, or the pathway out of the cave, and they come to see, quote unquote, the light, right? They see the sun, they see the objects that were actually the originals of the shadows. For example, they, instead of seeing a horse shadow, they see an actual horse out in the field. Well, does Plato adequately address the idea that, well, how do we know that we're not just in some larger cave, right? Okay, well, in a sense, he does make that point, right? Because the physical horse that you see outside of the cave, that's less real than, say, the mathematics or the form of horseness. But how do we get there, right? It's kind of like, how do you know that you're not dreaming? Well, the classic example is, well, pinch me, I must be dreaming. As if the pinch could tell you or act as a mark, a distinction between the dream world and the real, authentic, real world, right? How do you know you're not dreaming that you're being pinched, right? Well, okay, I guess I did dream that I was pinched, but pinch me again, because I must be, it just goes on to infinity. How do you know that you're not dreaming that you're dreaming that you're being pinched, etc.? So that's one way you can challenge this kind of idea from Plato, that we can actually make this distinction. The question is, how do we do it? What mark is there to show us this distinction between what appears and what is real? All right. Any questions about the myth of the cave? It is it's an interesting story. There's a whole lot of metaphysical or Platonic ideas sort of shoved into it. It's only one very small part of the larger book, The Republic. We're going to take some of these ideas and kind of apply them to some of the stuff that Sherry Turkle is talking about in her I believe we have 2 chapters from her book called Alone Together. Who is Sherry Turkle? Well, she's a professor of social studies of science and technology at MIT, trained psychoanalyst. She's most famous, I think, for writing on technology issues, which she's actually been doing for quite a long time, right? So 1984, which doesn't seem like a long time ago from my perspective, I suppose, but a book comes out, The Second Self. That's just the first sort of foray into discussing technology and how it relates to us, right? 10 years later, roughly, life on the screen. That's an interesting one because the internet wasn't fully robust in 1995. You had AOL chat rooms, that sort of thing. The Inner History of Devices, Alone Together, that's this one. Reclaiming Conversation, that's just going to be a continuation of some of the ideas that she's talking about here. And what do I know? She probably has a new book. She's kind of like an author that we're going to read a little later, Cass Sunstein, who seems to come out with a new book like twice a year. He writes on similar issues, and we're going to read something from him as well. All right. So what is this basic kind of analysis that she's giving? I mean, it's like 17 pages or whatever, this chapter, this introduction, but there's a few basic points, I think, that we want to look at, right? She is actually kind of talking about some of the Platonic issues, right? So the basic argument here, technology promises a certain intimacy with other people, right? Or what we take to be other people, but offers substitutions for real, authentic intimacy. So one of the questions here is human relations, right? Intimate human relations. How, we're all probably familiar with normal, quote unquote, normal human relations with actual people. So we can recognize what we call intimacy. Is it the case, this is the big question, is it the case that that same kind of thing can happen through the technology? So a few questions here, and this is also kind of springboarding off of Plato, right? What counts as authentic intimacy, right? If you ask that question, or if you start talking in these ways as Turkle does, you're implying that there is inauthentic intimacy, right? There's the appearance of intimacy versus real intimacy. And that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of distinction that she actually wants to make when talking about this technology. So this first whole part of her chapter, she's talking about, robot technology. Can intimacy with a robot actually be authentic, right? And she discusses, discussions that she's had with other writers, journalists, etc., who take her to task essentially by saying, look, you're assuming that we cannot have actual intimate relations with machines, right? Sex robots, that kind of thing. That's something she discusses here. And the question is that a kind of prejudice that she has, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, against relationships that we might have with artifacts, right? Essentially artifacts, really complex artifacts, but artifacts nonetheless, machines, devices, technology that we create. Can intimacy with strangers on the internet be authentic? This is just sort of an expansion of that basic idea. So she starts out talking about actual physical robots, right? And you can kind of take this idea and apply it to the kinds of relationships that you have on the internet, be it Facebook, Instagram, whatever. Obviously, Facebook, as we said on Mondays in the news, little did we all know, I suppose, that Facebook was melting down during class last time. That would be a system failure, I would imagine, that happened on Monday. But Facebook is in the news, and Facebook owns Instagram, and Facebook owns WhatsApp, and probably some other things. And recent studies have shown that use of Facebook, use of Instagram has essentially detrimental psychological effects on people. And of course, Mark Zuckerberg has to come out and say, no, it doesn't, right? I think it's great. It's this connectivity that is what he's after. And so he has to make this argument that intimacy with people through this technology is authentic. The question is it? And how do we come to that, right? How are we supposed to tell whether social media relations are authentic or not? This is kind of the Platonic question, right? Is there a way? I mean, he has the cave, right? Once you're out of the cave, of course, this is a metaphor or a story. Once you're out of the cave, you can see reality as it really is. Once you start to do philosophy, you can see reality as it really is, right? Something beyond the appearances. Can you do something like this with an analysis of social media relations? Are there authentic ones versus inauthentic ones, just like there are probably authentic relations in the real world and inauthentic ones? What does it mean to say that kind of stuff? And how do you tell? Right? I think at least the starting point is there's a vague feeling. I mean, for example, for the most part, I think people can tell when somebody is being inauthentic towards us, right? They want us for something else. They're not really invested in who we are as people, that kind of thing. There's a kind of a vague feeling that you can get from people. Well, that's actually pretty difficult to analyze and sort of systematically understand. Can we do that? Is there an objective standard for what counts as an authentic versus an inauthentic relation? Going off of Plato's, cave story, he would probably say there is. It might be really difficult to figure out what that is, but that distinction does in fact exist. As I mentioned, Plato himself has a pretty difficult time showing us how to get to knowledge of the real versus appearances. But what he's doing with the cave story is showing that that distinction does in fact exist, whether we can actually ultimately make it ourselves, right? Again, knowledge is, for Plato, knowledge is a really difficult thing to achieve ultimately. So, but we can ask these kinds of questions, right? So what's interesting for me, at least, or how we're approaching these through the course, is that Turkle kind of crystallizes a lot of elements from our readings that we've had. And so I just want to run through a few of those. And we'll also kind of relate some of this back to Plato before we get to his next short reading. So the first issue is revenge effects, right? This is just the tenor article. Revenge effects, the idea of unintended consequences that are ironic. All right, so she says, as we distribute ourselves on social media, that's the focus here, we may abandon ourselves. So once you put yourself out there across different media, different apps, different social media platforms, etc., where do you, the real you, if there is such a thing, where are you now? Where are you located, right? Because people use social media apps for a whole bunch of different things. Is it the case that, in a way, you're, by creating different profiles, right, different avatars, different characters in video games even, is it the case that once you start doing that and it really sort of blossoms, you sort of lose the original self, right? So this is kind of a tenor element here, this irony, right? Social media is meant to connect ourselves with others as widely as possible. And we think that we're doing that when we're going out there and using all of these different apps. But the case, is it the case? This is the question. The self diminishes to serve sort of this lowest common denominator. And then do we actually end up feeling isolated? Because you can think of it this way. If you're so invested in different social media applications, are you in some sense spreading yourself thin, right? You're appealing to the lowest common denominator of who you think you are, right? You're only revealing different shards of yourself as were according to which app you're using. Largely to get things like likes, or what is it, the little heart on Twitter, or I don't even know on Instagram. What is it on Instagram? I don't know anything about Instagram, thankfully. Likes, is it? I don't know. I do know that Instagram, weren't they toying with the idea of dismantling the like function because of these psychological issues?
That was briefly considered in a time, and then Facebook bought it. So
Oh, okay. This was before Facebook. That's interesting.
Well, I mean, you can still turn it on for your individual profile, but it's not for every profile.
Exactly.
Is that the default position, that it's off?
No, it's the default that it's on.
Okay. Interesting. That's interesting. Thanks, Mark Zuckerberg. Just kidding. Another quote: connectivity technologies once promised to give us more time, but as the cell phone and smartphone eroded the boundaries between work and leisure, all time in the world was not enough. Right. So again, this is just kind of going back to that theme that we've kind of looked at from the very beginning of the course, the promise of technologies, right? Technologies, by and large, promise to make our lives easier in some ways, but end up recomplicating or complicating them in ways that we didn't really foresee. Even things like the nuclear bomb, right? Think of that. Well, this is going to make war a lot simpler because we have this might. Well, it didn't. It created the Cold War, which was a much more, complicated situation than it was before nuclear weapons existed. And you essentially had to sit on the edge of your seat while, the powers that be played game theory all day. So technology promises to make things easier, but ultimately, in a lot of cases, it makes them more complicated, right? Smartphone technology, as she says here, cell phones. What do we always have on us, right? Our cell phone. You can't even, function at the university if you don't have it, essentially. So she also says we turn to technology to help us find time, right? To simplify things. But technology makes us busier than ever and ever more in search of retreat, right? So going back to tenor again, we can think of this as a repeating effect, a time saver thing, something that's supposed to save time for us. In the end, ends up requiring more time or robbing us of this time that it promised, right? So that's the irony. That's the ironic, unintended consequence of this technology. And I think we can all feel it, right? You get the smartphone and with all the apps so that it's a lot easier to do things like pay your bill. Oh, I just touch this button and click, send or whatever it is. But now it's also complicating your life because you're completely attached to it and you now have to use it for essentially everything, right? Quote, easy connection becomes redefined as intimacy. Now, this is getting back to the issue of intimacy. Put otherwise, cyber intimacies slide into cyber solitudes, right? That's interesting, right? Connection with other people, in whatever way you want to cash that out, is a lot easier through these apps, right? People you haven't seen since high school. Of course, for some of you, that might be, 3 months ago. Childhood friends, your cousins who live across the entire, out in California or whatever. This connection becomes easy. Does that mean it's intimate? Are we, in fact, mistaking the easy connectability to people we know and to people we don't know, new people that we're meeting online? Are we mistaking this for actual intimacy, right? On Twitter, for example, you hear a lot of stories of, people who meet on Twitter and then they meet in real life. And sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. Are the successful ones, here's a question, are the successful ones IRL in real life, a product of an actual intimacy that developed online? And so then the question is, well, maybe you can, in fact, have authentic intimacy through this technology. So the ironic tenor element, the technology meant for real intimacy ultimately will create solitude, right? You can kind of compare some of the issues from Frankenstein here. So what did Frankenstein do? Created a being meant for good, ended up creating evil, creating harm against humanity, when in fact what he wanted to do was figure out the secrets of life for the good of humanity. A social element is also here, right? Frankenstein created this creature who, if we in the end think of this creature as a person or an entity with personhood, which I think a lot of interpretations actually do, just given what what the creature says during the core part of the novel. If the creature is in fact a person or has personhood, then since persons, we might say, are social, so too would be the creature. But if you remember, the creature was in some sense lost and alone in the world, isolated and forced to live in solitude. So again, creating something that's intrinsically social ends up being isolated in the world. We are social beings, right? Is social media, how much work is that word social doing? Is it kind of eroding the social aspect of social media itself? Is the technology doing that? Right. Any questions about how this stuff can be tied to tenor, for example?
Questions on how this ties into tenor?
I mean, we've basically just gone over some of the ways.
All right. Can I bring up a possibly relevant concept?
Yes.
So one documented phenomenon that's been talked about in a variety of periodicals that look at technology news is the phenomenon of what's called parasocial relationships. So parasocial relationships, they're not necessarily unique to social media. They've been around for a long time, but they're coming under scrutiny now. In the 60s, in the sort of the mid 20th century, it was usually late night loyalty. So like people would turn on the Tonight Show, which back then was with Johnny Carson, and people would have a loyalty, feel a friendship, feel a kinship, even though they had never met. And you get very similar things with YouTube creators, Twitch creators, podcast hosts. And because of the interactivity, it actually creates much more friction sometimes, considering that there's a presumption of intimacy that isn't actually there. And it's a kind of an interesting tangle, at least worth a Google if you want to look into it.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. I think that's exactly right. And it probably even predates that. I mean, it probably predates telecommunications technology. These kinds of, as you call them, parasocial relations probably existed always, in a sense.
Sure. You could probably, if you wanted to really dig deep, you could probably get a case for parasocial relationships in Don Quixote with the inspiration of, medieval knights and chivalry and what have you.
Oh, yeah, exactly. That's good. See, literature is important, students. That's a really good point. And I think that it's definitely, that kind of thing is definitely being enhanced now that Johnny Carson is, with me in my hand right now on my phone. In any of these kinds of relationships, we can take them with us wherever we go. Now, then the psychological question there is that just enhancing this non-relationship of parasocial relationships, like in the 60s, that we would have to say Johnny Carson or any other celebrity? Is it enhancing that friction just through the technology itself because it's so ubiquitous? That's a good point. All right, a couple of Platonic issues related to Turkle. Again, this is going to be the issue of authenticity versus inauthenticity for the most part. So she says, for most people, the blurring of intimacy and solitude begins when one creates a profile on a social networking site or builds a persona or avatar for a game or a virtual world, right? So not just social media, you can throw in internet gaming which really is kind of a social media technology these days, right? People hang out through the games that they're playing. In fact, fairly recently, locally, at least on the west side of the state, there was a case of a guy playing a video game with somebody in, like, I don't know, North Carolina or something. And, smoking weed, playing the game, probably a violent game. Who knows? They connected on in some way. And the guy in Michigan said, "Hey, can you do something for me? Can you pretend to be me for a few days and, use my credit card and, just do whatever, pretend to be me." Okay, well, why? Oh, it's just a thing that I'm going to do. And he ends up traveling to Michigan and murdering his ex-wife, right? So he was creating this alibi. So what kind of relationship was that, right? The point here is that you're creating these profiles, and sometimes we do so for specific reasons, right? You're creating a certain profile in a game. Go back to the cat at the beginning, right? You want to be a ferocious warrior. I mean, these are the jokes, of course, that people have been telling for the last 10 years. The ferocious warrior is really just some, kid in a basement somewhere or whatever. But that's not the only profile that we create, right? We create other profiles and for other purposes, right? Over time, such performances of identity, Turkle says, may feel like identity itself. So here she is, in fact, invoking the distinction between a real identity and what she calls a mere performance of identity. So the cat at the beginning is performing, as it were, in front of the mirror as a lion. The kid in the basement is performing, as it were, as some, medieval warrior or a military soldier or something, whatever game they're playing. I don't know anything about games, so don't chastise me there. So the question is, this performance of identity, is there a principled way that we can make a distinction between that and, quote unquote, identity itself? I think that that's actually a real question, and I'm not entirely sure that you can. I don't know what the principled way to make that distinction is, but if you go back to Plato, he's at least going to say that there is that distinction, and Turkle here is also saying that there's that distinction. So is this a confusion, this performance of identity versus identity itself? Is this a confusion about what's real and what's only apparent? Is it a confusion on the part of the person who actually does create these profiles, or do they know exactly what they're doing? So one question is, and she brings this up, robots, I guess, is the more stark example, but also network technology, social media, the people that you meet, the robots that you are intimate with, I guess, only perform this caring behavior. They don't actually care. So again, she's making this distinction between a performance of caring versus actually caring. Can we make that distinction? The other question, the other side of that would be, well, maybe it's all performance, right? Maybe there really is no core identity, but in any given context, we are performing, necessarily, I guess, because that's how the situation is. We're performing an identity, and there is no such thing as a core identity. So that's one question that you can sort of challenge Turkle about, challenge Plato about. Here's a nice quote from James Griffin from a book called Well-Being, Its Measurement, Meaning, and Moral Practice. It's kind of getting to these same things. And what I think Griffin is doing here is kind of giving us sort of intuitive understanding, an intuition about real versus not real. So he says, I prefer, you don't have to write this down, this is just a quote. I prefer, in important areas of my life, bitter truth to comfortable delusion. Even if I were surrounded by consummate actors, right, performers, able to give me sweet simulacra, simulation, of love and affection, I should prefer the relatively bitter diet of their authentic relations. And I should prefer it not because it would be morally better or aesthetically better or more noble, but because it would make for a better life for me to live. So it's, I guess, ironic in a way, this bitter authenticity, right? Authenticity sometimes can be jarring or, make us feel bad. Prefers that to people essentially faking it, right? I once knew somebody who sort of didn't look you in the eye, and it's almost as if she was feigning reading cue cards during conversations. It's not like she, couldn't look you in the eye. It's that she wouldn't. And she's as if she was reading cue cards. That's a sort of blatant, I'm at the core an actor or something, personality type, I think. But that's one of those vague feelings where you kind of think, well, this person's really just kind of performing and not, authentic, right? The idea here is that reality is hard. Does that, warts and all elements to it, does that make it more preferable? Or would we just rather be surrounded by people who say yes to us all the time? Or that's right, you can't be wrong, right? This person prefers kind of the nitty gritty of actual life. But I think that gets kind of the heart of our vague feelings about authentic versus inauthentic. And this person here is saying they want this authenticity, and this is kind of what it looks like. So the critique that I've sort of been giving here, or leading up to, I suppose, and I've kind of given some clues along the way, is Turkle being unfair to this new technological revolution, just say smartphone, social media revolution of the last 20 or so years? Does she, for example, assume that robots and social media technologies and relations cannot be caring, cannot be authentically caring? Does she assume that we are socially and psychologically changing through this lack of authenticity? So you have to have the lack of authenticity has to be a real thing if it's going to be socially and psychologically changing us. So that second bullet point here kind of relies on the truth or falsity of whether these kinds of technology relations are always going to be inauthentic. That's the interesting thing, because you ask somebody old like me and Sherry Turkle, we're not as old as each other. You ask somebody like us who didn't literally grow up within the booming time of social media and the internet, we step back a little bit from it and say, yeah, there might be something inauthentic about these relationships. But for people of college age or just starting college or who are in college, that's all they've known, right? People have grown up they've been born within the internet world, right? And so I think that younger people, and we're going to read an article that discusses some of this a little later. For younger people, this is pretty normal, right? People prefer to text and instead of making a phone call, as I believe she mentions in the article, right? People prefer to sort of mediate their relationships through this technology, but it's mostly people who were born within this technology. So back to Plato. How are we supposed to tell if it is in fact possible whether a technology does or does not authentically care about us, or whether the people on the other end, I guess, are real? And by real, I mean not just like, it's a bot or something like that, but real in the sense of being authentic, right? How are we supposed to know this? What are we supposed to invoke? What standards or principles should we appeal to when we're trying to figure out whether the robot loves me or not, right? It's not clear, but we've already looked at a couple of things, right? The Turing test. If the entity on the other end, and could be a robot, but ostensibly somebody talking to us online or whatever, if they pass this Turing test, should that count in some way towards authenticity? What about our own psychological responses? This is something Turkle gets at in the article when she talks about, for example, the elderly woman who has this robot pet. She has a positive psychological response. Is that going to be enough to call it authentic, right? If the technology's response makes me happy, then why can't I just play along? But when you're playing along, are you being authentic? If it's not playing along, then why not just call it authentic, right? Well, because it's a robot. That's question begging, isn't it? Is that what Turkle's doing? All right, so these are some questions that we're going to be talking about a little bit through the past the midterm with some other articles, just the authenticity and other elements of social media and online relationships. Any questions before we get to the next Plato bit?
Questions about authenticity, Turkle, or anything we've covered so far?
Or robots.
Or robots.
All right. Okay. Speaking of movies or other movies based on Plato, The Ring of Gaijis, it's another section from Plato's Republic. Is that actually the ring from the movie Lord of the Rings? The picture that you're seeing?
Yes, I see the speech of Mordor, which I will not utter here.
Okay, good. So yeah, Lord of the Rings is very similar to the story that Plato's telling in the Republic. I think that there's debate actually about whether the book is in some sense influenced by it or not. I don't know anything about it. So
it was minorly influenced by both the Ring of Gaijis as well as the Kalevala.
Oh, good. Yeah, I think I've heard that. Interesting. Full disclosure, I've not seen any of the movies or read the books. I have them and they're on a shelf.
I forgive you. It's okay.
Yeah, right. People are shocked about that, but hey, or Harry Potter as well. So I'm just not cool. All right. So the major question that Plato is sort of raising here, it's basically the most basic question in ethics. Why be moral? Why act ethically? And just to put this in context of the Republic itself as a book, it comes at the beginning of the second book of the Republic. There's 10 books. So it comes towards the beginning of the book. And it's a development of some stuff that comes in the first book of the Republic. And it's made, I guess, into a it's not treated as a legitimate question in the first book. It's treated as a legitimate question at the beginning of the second book. And Socrates says, geez, Glaucon, this is a really difficult question. I'm going to have to take a few detours if I want to answer it adequately. And then the rest of the Republic is Socrates taking all these different detours, trying to answer this basic question. One of the biggest detours is, in fact, the myth of the cave, where he gets all metaphysical. That's part of this larger project of answering this basic question, why be moral? And if you know anything about the Republic, part of that project is to build an ideal city to answer some of these questions about ethics. We don't need to go into any of that, but it's really interesting. I'm sure they have about 10 copies in the library if you're bored. So the position here is it's Socrates against his interlocutor Glaucon. And Glaucon is sort of playing devil's advocate, right? He argues against Socrates on this basic idea about being just, right? Socrates thinks that being just is an intrinsically good thing. And Glaucon says, well, wait a minute. I'm not sure that that's true. So the Ring of Gaijis is a thought experiment, right? It's designed to show that everyone, even those people who think that they are supremely just, can ultimately be corruptible given the right circumstances. How is this related to some of the stuff that we're talking about, social media, et cetera? Well, the issue of anonymity, right? Does the anonymity provided by social media raise similar ethical questions as the invisibility given by the Ring of Gaijis? So, and what's interesting is that if you kind of go on Google and type some of this stuff in, there's a few articles written in the past 5 years or so making this connection. So it's a pretty interesting approach from philosophy and literature to some of these ideas about social media that people have been talking about more and more over the last 5 years. All right, so what's the basic idea here? Imagine two rings, right? One is worn by an unjust person and one is worn by a just person. The question is, would the ring that makes you invisible when you turn it or whatever it is, would the ring corrupt the just person and make them unjust, right? Given the circumstances that the ring provides, wouldn't the quote unquote just person be just as easily corruptible as the unjust person? So Glaucon's point here is it's actually rational to choose, right? It's a reasonable thing to do to choose, given this option that the ring provides, living a life being unjust, but seeming just. Again, appearances versus reality issues right there, versus a life of being just, but seeming unjust. Given the option, any rational, reasonable person would choose a life where everybody thinks you're a god. Everybody thinks you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, when behind the scenes, what you're doing is ruining people's lives, being cruel and enjoying it, murdering people without, any repercussions, essentially getting away with anything you want, right? Doing whatever you want with impunity, no consequences. And at the same time, everybody thinks you're, the greatest thing since sliced bread, the supremely just person, when in fact, the reality is you're not. It's rational to choose that life versus a life of utter misery, right? Who would choose to be just and also tortured because everybody thinks that you're unjust, when in fact you're really just, right? You're a real, you're like Jesus or somebody, and the Romans are whipping you and putting a, crown of thorns on your head or whatever, because they think that you're the devil. No one's going to choose that life. Everybody's going to choose the life of the supremely terrible, cruel, unjust person who everybody thinks is great. Smile for the camera, that kind of thing. So he's saying the basic argument here is pretty much anyone would choose that life over being tortured, even though you're good, right? Well, my heart's in the right place. Yeah, but they're going to kill you soon, right? And Socrates actually says, no, if we think about it, that's the life that one should choose. That's the life it's moral to choose. All right, back to the internet. We can take this kind of idea here and ask this question, right? How might social media do three different things? Inform our sense of who we are. Perhaps use of social media allows us to discover things about ourselves that we didn't really realize. How might social media empower us, right? Does anonymity sometimes make our lives better or empower us in some ways? And of course, like the Gaiji's story, how might social media use corrupt our sense of who we are? So these three questions, that's it. I'm just going to go through them. All right. Let's take the first one. How might social media inform our sense of self, right? Does one's profile, for example, just to use, Facebook or Twitter or whatever, does one's profile on social media reflect a sense of self that one has? Does it transform, or can it transform a sense of oneself? Right? Does your use of or creation of what's the relation that it has to what you take yourself to be, in real life? Just a few examples. Facebook, right? It's obviously in the news. You create a profile that may leave things about you out. It may exaggerate things. You may or may not use your actual an image of yourself as your profile picture. If you don't, what does that say about you, right? What does that say about what you want to reveal? If you do use your own image, what does that say about you? What kind of image are you using? And what's really interesting about this as well is that when you're doing this, you're acting as a user, right? You're creating content, essentially. Well, Facebook behind the scenes is also creating its own content. It's creating its own version of you from your information. What does that mean? It's creating its version of you from the pictures that you post, from the engagement that you are involved with, which means the likes, which means the comments that you're making, which means the comments that you're making in certain places, which means how long you hover over a picture with your mouse, or how long you have a picture on your screen. It's taking all of that data and putting it somewhere as you, right? And then from that, one of the reasons why you get all these, things popping up on your newsfeed. I just read something where Facebook's uncool to people of college age, but we're going to talk about it anyway because it's in the news. One reason why this stuff, weird stuff sometimes pops up on your newsfeed is because of this right? So does this use of Facebook change how we view ourselves based, for example, on what's coming at us from our newsfeed, right? Twitter, right? You create a Twitter handle, you choose the picture, you choose what it's called, unless you don't, and then Twitter assigns you this weird long number. Does your Twitter handle inform how you act or engage with others on Twitter, right? So people, this is more easy to see, I think, on Twitter than on something like Facebook, but there's a group of people who, whatever their profile picture is, it's usually like a cartoon or something. They've banded together somehow, maybe through a hashtag or something, and decided to all make their Twitter profile pictures in a certain way. So they can identify each other on Twitter, right? Oh, this person is the kind of person that thinks like me, for example, or these are the kinds of people that I want to avoid or troll or, cause havoc for, et cetera, et cetera. What does your profile picture and your handle say about what you're doing with that technology? So it's possible that the use of the technology itself can actually inform certain things about our personalities. It can also empower us. So this is sort of a positive reading, right? Can anonymity empower people in shaping how they understand themselves? Identity exploration, right? If you're, especially you get this, I think, in adolescence, right? If you're not really sure of how you should be thinking about yourself, et cetera, can acting anonymously on social media help people kind of figure out who they are without any fear of repercussion? The downside might be, is there a point to this kind of activity, identity exploration, when online identity exploration becomes sort of an active identity creation? That's not necessarily the downside, of course, because if your activity is revealing things about yourself, that's how people create their identities anyway, right? Self-help forums, physical and mental health issues, the use of anonymity can obviously be pretty helpful there, I believe. Even political and other kinds of debates, right? This is where things get a little bit tricky. Anonymity can allow people to engage in political debate or discussion that they might actually avoid in real life. What's interesting, though, and I think that this is just a phenomenon in the last few years, is that people start doing this on, say, Facebook, and things get heated, well, has that mentality sort of spilled over into real life, right? It's their activity in political discussions on Facebook empowers them to actually go out and into the real world and sort of enact what they've been doing online at, say, school board meetings, right? Perhaps you've seen in the news, there have been violent school board meetings over the last few years or so, which is kind of bizarre, right? They're talking about budgets, and all these people want to talk about is critical race theory. Well, guess what? Nobody teaches critical race theory in elementary, middle, or high school, but they want to talk about it. Why? Because they started online with this discussion. And of course, that also leads into the corruption of our sense of self. Anonymity can do this as well. Same kind of thing. So this is kind of another side to this coin, right? Anonymity allows for a sort of haphazard identity exploration that can, in fact, lead to mental health problems, right? If we're spreading ourselves too thin across different platforms, maybe we sort of lose a sense of ourselves because we start identifying more with our online selves than with anything in the real world. So the question there is, can we ultimately end up internalizing this sort of outward online behavior and then thereby changing our conceptions of ourselves, right? The selfie generation. People always have taken pictures of themselves, right? They used to have these things called photo booths, right? Where you'd sit down and they'd take pictures and you'd get like a little printout or whatever. Well, the selfie generation through this technology is just a vastly exaggerated version of that. And you can share it with the entire planet, not with just, your close friends. Online influencers, you start out maybe, I want to, talk about fashion or whatever, but then you sort of get wrapped up in this personality, right? There's been a few news stories about that, how the online personality just sort of takes over somebody's life. And people quit. They quit their influencing job because it gets too much. The concept of YouTube celebrity, right? So the idea here is that the you outside in the real world start to become the self that you're presenting to your followers. And what kind of effect does that have on individuals psychologically? But then also, what kind of effect is that going to have socially, right? Politically? There's another issue about empathy, and this is from an article that I read. I don't know the source, but there's this article and another one that I can put on D2L. This is called the Gaiji's effect, right? Is it doing something to our sense of empathy? So social media technology seems to, in the last few years, have the effect of encouraging sort of disinhibition through anonymity, right? So if people don't know who you are, you can be the biggest jerk on the planet. Of course, sometimes that backfires because people like Anonymous or whatever, ironically, Anonymous searches you out and they dox you. They put your real life information out there. But it also seems to it seems to be having this psychological effect of shutting down our empathy, right? So one issue here, does the internet, these are two sides, right? Two ways of thinking about this. You might want to weigh them together. Does the internet offer this unique ability to critique those who don't or can't reasonably know something, right? So that's a good side, I think, of anonymity, right? You can better critique somebody's ideas or beliefs without the fear of, say, this blowback or something like that. Or does the technology itself, in some sense, prohibit the sort of knowledge that's actually encouraged by face-to-face meetings? Is face-to-face meetings with people like, you confront Preacher Bob outside of Wells Hall or whatever, or actually he confronts you for the most part. is that somehow different in kind than what you can get on the internet? I don't know the answer to that. That's something worth arguing about, I think. Now, of course, one of the big elements with the Ring of Gaijis is the concept of trolling, right? Three motives for trolling: boredom, right? Doing something for the lulz. That's actually kind of dangerous these days, right? Because you can be as cruel as you want, and then always after the fact say, well, I was just joking, right? That's becoming a thing, and it's kind of becoming a dangerous thing, as we'll see a little bit later in the semester. Boredom, that's one. So that's one of the motives. A need for attention. I'll say this: these three motives are pretty intimately related. If you're bored, it might be because you lack attention. But even a sense of disenfranchisement, right? Political disenfranchisement sometimes motivates people to go out and troll. One interesting problem there is this sort of, circular element. Does disenfranchisement lead to more trolling, right? So you feel politically disenfranchised, so you go on the internet and start, getting up in people's comments, for example. But then does that just sort of enhance further your feeling of disenfranchisement? Why? Because you start finding people who think like you, and then you start banding together, right? And then once you have a group identity, you can start more aggressively trolling. Well, once you do that, it just leads to more, blah, blah. It's like a cycle, right? An echo chamber, as it were. Is this the kind of thing that happens from the possibility of trolling through anonymity? So I'm going to take this idea and just give you, and this is the other article that I'll put up. It's the story of this guy, Lane Davis, right? So I'll give this as an optional reading. The title is Alt-Right Troll to Father Killer: The Unraveling of Lane Davis. So I just want to give you this long quote from the article. Of course, you don't have to write this down. It says, Lane was immersed in the digital chaos of reactionary culture and politics that has become an inescapable part of American life. So they're already acknowledging that there's this connection between online use, social media use, and the political discourse that we have right now. Writing under the name Seattle for Truth, Lane was an indefatigable culture warrior and a wildly inventive conspiracist. He left a footprint online as wide and weird as his imprint on the physical world was small and sad, right? Hundreds of YouTube videos, thousands of tweets, hundreds of blog posts, hundreds of Reddit comments, and most of all, years of chats, Slack messages, and Google Hangouts with his fellow travelers. Well, what did he do? He sort of started getting into sort of right-wing neo-Nazi stuff online, probably 4chan and all that stuff. And eventually his father confronted him about it, and he killed his father, right? You go into Lane Davis's bedroom. Basically, it wasn't carpeted. It was just beer cans, right? And he had all this technology there. And so he just holed himself up in a sort of Plato's cave of his own creation and became this Seattle for Truth personality, this person, this other self, as it were. So some questions about this. Now, Lane Davis was largely an unknown and unseen person in real life, right? Small and sad, as the article says. So a few questions here is, was the technology itself one of the important factors in his sort of unraveling? Well, of course it was, I think. I mean, but the question is, to what degree is this a likely outcome given the way the technology is right now? Is there something about this anonymity afforded by our social media technology that really does, give a change to the psychology of the users, right? That's another question. The ring of Gaijis, just for your own, questioning, do you agree with Glaucon that this ring and then the internet itself tends to reveal that humans are sort of unjust given the right kind of circumstances? In other words, would you, if you had the ring, go out and do bad stuff? Or does the ring or the internet tend to create this, right? What's the difference between that, revealing or creating? Well, I've always taken myself to be a good person, but now that I've given the chance, I'm just going to go out and be bad. A related question is this. Given the chance, it's kind of like that movie. What's that movie? The Purge, is that it? I don't know.
We're talking about there's one day where all laws are moot and you can go ahead and just do what you need for 24 hours.
Yeah, crime is legal or something like that. I think there's a few different versions of this movie or sequels or whatever.
Yeah, there's a lot of sequels.
But the question there is, given that chance, would you go out and, rape and pillage and murder? It's an interesting question. I think that some people don't really think about, of course, but for a lot of people, it's like, no, I wouldn't. Well, the only thing that's holding me back from enacting the purge is there's laws against it. So if you got rid of the laws, you better believe that I'd be out there killing people. Well, doesn't that just reveal that you're a bad person anyway, right? So the question is, are people naturally bad, and given the chance, they just go out and do bad things? Or is it sort of more in the opposite? People are naturally good, and the reason that they're not doing things is not because there's laws holding them in. It's because they basically think that those things are wrong. I think ultimately that's kind of the point that Socrates wants and Plato wants to make in the Republic and elsewhere. But the ring of Gaijis and internet anonymity seems to be challenging that to a large degree these days.